How to take a flat piece of fabric and shape it around a very three-dimensional body is the age-old fashion question, and one we've come up with many, many answers to, but at the moment, I'm interested in smocking. If you took someone off the street and said, take this fabric and make it this big, they would probably just add some embroidery, and that is pretty much what smocking is, with many, many more steps and many, many more hours. If you're a 90s kid like me, you were probably shoved into a hand-me-down smocked frock a la 11 from Stranger Things at some point. And yeah, this technique has been super popular in children's wear for the past 100 or so years. So let's see if we can elevate it just a little bit and get something a modern adult can wear. I'm definitely not a smocking newbie, but I've mainly done American smocking in the past, which is what you see on like pillows and stuff. And I eventually want to create a modern version of this English work shirt from the 19th century, which means learning English smocking. To begin, you'll obviously need fabric. Since this will create a lot of volume, simple plain woven cotton fabric, like quilting fabric, is a popular option, but anything can be smocked. You'll need a needle. I recommend an embroidery needle, which has a long, narrow eye and a sharp point. Sturdy gathering thread. I recommend smooth cotton quilting thread. Embroidery floss. I used good, reliable DMC cotton, and something to mark the fabric with. I used a friction pen until I realized that this was going to take a lot of ink, and then I switched to pencil. I began with a sampler. Seems the sensible thing to do when learning a new craft. English smocking requires the fabric to be gathered precisely, which means it needs to be marked precisely. The fastest and most precise way I've found to do this is to make sure your fabric is squared at the corners and mark the grid increments along the warp and weft edges. You can smock in any increment. The bigger the increment, the more dramatic the gathering. For this sampler, I used half-inch increments because I didn't want to go crazy on a sampler. Then align your ruler. I have this absurdly long ruler because of smocking, and you can either mark individual dots at the gathering points or just draw a line to make a grid. Once the whole fabric is marked, you should run a gathering thread through the intersections of the grid. For me, this was the most tedious part of the craft. I gathered the running stitches and secured the gathering in place by tying off the ends, and the work was ready to smock. I loosely followed this smocking manual, by the way. The first stitch is an outline stitch, similar to a stem stitch in embroidery. I tied a knot in the floss and brought it from back to the front at the leftmost point. I then brought the needle through the peak of the next gather right to left. For this stitch, the needle should stay below the floss of the active stitch. And that's it. This same motion gets worked over and over again to create a smooth, even line of stitching. Smooth-ish. Remember, I'm learning this too. I should also mention that smocking moves from the non-dominant side to the dominant. I stitch right-handed, so I went left to right overall, but the individual stitches are still worked right to left. The next basic stitch is the cable stitch, and it is very similar to the outline stitch. Instead of always keeping the needle below the active stitch, it is alternated so that it comes out above the active stitch, then below. The result is a choppier line. If you do two of these lines close to each other, alternating the over-under needle orientation, you get a double cable, which has a sort of box stitch effect. The next stitch I wanted to master was the diamond stitch, which is very similar to the cable stitch, but rather than working along the same gathering line, you alternate between one gathering line and the next one down. The result is this sort of zigzag V-stitch. The last stitch I was interested in was the honeycomb stitch, which, spoiler alert, I found to be the most difficult stitch. I mean, nothing too bad, but it took a while to master. As you can likely guess by now, this stitch starts as all the others, but instead of bringing the needle directly out the other side of the second stitch, you slide the needle down to the next row of drawing threads and bring the needle out to the inside of the pleat. So the same position you would bring it out to do another outline stitch, just one row down. Then you do the exact same thing, just bringing the stitch back up to the top row. That's it, but it can get a little fiddly. And down the road I found the best way to work this stitch was to release the gathering thread and work it loose. There are other stitches, and of course so many combinations and variations, but these stitches and variations are a good backbone for English smocking. Smocking in general is a lot like knitting. Yes, there's a stitch count and some math if you want to make something the right size, but personally I loved working with the properties of the different stitches. All smocking stitches are slightly elastic, but the diamond is more elastic than the outline or cable stitches, and the honeycomb is the most elastic of all. That and the surface texture provide a lot of fun engineering work. Okay, so these are some basic smocking stitches, but how do you take this and turn it into a garment? I am super fortunate to have this amazing extant garment in my archive. I think this is from the mid to late 19th century, and it's a work shirt, or so says my friend who does museum curation. It's made from a thick-ish cotton, and the floss is a 2-ply twisted silk. It has smocking at the front and back chest, which would have given the worker some ease of movement, and smocking at the shoulder and wrist, where it would have been necessary to hold the fabric in. It also has this darling embroidery at the collar and cuffs. These lovely covered buttons, a nice deep hem. If I could just put this on and wear it as is, I totally would, but I won't. I don't know that I'm psychologically ready to just recreate this, but I am absolutely audacious enough to make a modern version of it. Something I haven't mentioned yet is that an important part of smocking lore is gingham. True gingham fabric is plain woven cotton fabric made from 2 colors where an even number of both colors is used in alternating chunks in the warp and weft, which creates a lovely perfectly square gridded fabric. Obviously, this negates all the fabric marking, and you can just follow the grid of the fabric to run the gathering threads for smocking. I have this shirting, which is not a true gingham since the color fields are not even and the gray is actually gray thread and not a combination of white and black, but smocking does not have to be even. I mean, it should be even, but the amount you take up from the front can be less than what you take up from the back. This is a pretty big grid, so using this will create a lot of volume below the smocking, but I've made these samples and I'm going for it. The original garment is a good, zero-waste, rectangle-based pattern similar to most smock or chemise patterns of the time. But I have a limited amount of fabric, and ironically, these kinds of zero-waste patterns tend to eat up a lot of fabric. So I began with the button-up shirt pattern I recently made instead. I marked where I wanted the smocking to sit. I did this slightly differently than the extant garment, but more on that in a minute. I quickly determined the smocked portion of the shirt should not button up, and I marked out where the smocking should start and therefore where the gathering threads should start, and used the width of the fabric along with the desired width of the shirt to determine just how much of the fabric could be smocked. I really loved the effect of the top of the smocking, and I didn't want to hide that in a seam the way it is in the original. To keep the top edge clean, I decided to double the fabric, which will leave the fold to be a super clean top of the fabric, and actually make my smocks go a little further since they're going through double the fabric. I pressed the top fold to within an inch of its life. I ran the gathering thread through every cross section using the grid as my guide. I found pinning one side to a pillow gave the piece some tension and made the process faster, but still very, very slow. Gathering gingham, or plaid in this case, is particularly satisfying. I used 3 of the 6 plies of DMC floss. I stitched 1 row of outline stitch in black along the top of the work. It blends in, but I think the texture alone kind of works. The majority of the embroidery was 3 strands of this stormy blue color, which I think adds a bit of calm to the high contrastness of the overall piece. I stitched a row of single cable along the top of the next black stripe. Another row along the top of the next black stripe. And another row along the bottom. It's not quite close enough to be a double cable stitch, but I was sure to invert the over-under orientation of the needle and thread for each row so they mirror each other. Next, I stitched a sort of elongated diamond stitch over 2 stripes. I did 2 diagonal stitches between each horizontal stitch. Since the stripes aren't equal, the result is this sort of undulating wave. I did 3 rows of this. I stitched a row of cable stitch in contrasting white floss and stitched 3 more rows of the undulating wave stitch. I stitched another row of white cable stitch, another row of undulating wave, and then I stitched 2 rows of honeycomb. This is where I stopped with the smocking, but the glorious thing about smocking is that you can add or subtract smocking anytime, something I took advantage of later in the project. On to the back. I am on the back now, which is going to be done exactly as the front was done. It's not taking as long as I thought it was going to. I kind of was buckled in and ready for this to take several days, and I'm getting each panel done in about a day of work, so that's good. And honestly, I am perfectly happy doing it because this is a lot more fun than I thought it was going to be. I mean, of course I thought it was going to be fun. I love hand sewing, I love doing embroidery, but I thought that it was just going to be really tedious after a while. But I don't know, there's something really satisfying about like all of this tidy stitching that's just, I miss this. So I'm happily smocking away. I cut the top of the front and back of the shirt from the dwindling amount of fabric I had left. I decided not to do the collar stand, and because of fabric limitations, I cut the collar as 2 pieces, with a split in the back. I cut the undercollar and under cuffs from the leftover cotton voile. The placket also had to be a separate piece, so I sewed it to both sides of the center front of the top of the shirt, right sides together. I pressed the placket to the wrong side and pressed a small seam allowance inward. I sewed this edge on the machine. I basted the plackets in their appropriate overlapping position. I placed the front smocked panel on top of the top front, right side to wrong side, and came to the realization there was no great way to connect them. I landed on ladder stitching the flat portion of the smocked panel to the top front panel. And I prick stitched the smocked portion from the wrong side. I then double folded the raw edge of the top front panel over and fell stitched it in place. I repeated most of that for the back. I matched the back panel to the front panel right sides together and sewed the shoulder seams. I finished the raw edges with another felled seam. The sleeves were mostly dictated by the remaining rectangles of fabric I had left. From there, I determined how much of the shoulder and wrist should be smocked to make the sleeve the correct size, and ran more gathering threads. I chose a similar embroidery pattern for the shoulder. I kept the wrists simple with a row of outline stitch, 4 rows of cable stitch, and a row of honeycomb. I was really scraping for fabric, but this needed an underarm gusset, so I cut 2 gussets from the remaining scraps. These could have been bigger. I sewed these to the top of the side seam of the sleeve, and matched this to the shoulder of the body similarly to my smock video. I sewed the flat portions in place, and hand-stitched the smocked portion in place from the right side. I sewed the collar, undercollar, and cuffs similarly to how I sewed them in the button-up shirt video. I chose to finish the neckline with this very wide bias tape, so I matched up the collar pieces to the neckline exactly as I wanted them to ultimately sit, then put the bias tape on top, right side down. I sewed this weird parfait in place. I snipped little relief gores into the seam allowance of the neckline. I attempted to hand stitch the folded edge of the bias tape in place. I have had the mysterious summer illness for the past couple of days. Definitely was not the Rona. I tested for that and I tested negative twice. It wasn't really an intense illness that took me out of commission, just like little aches and pains and some congestion, which caused me to be a bit loopy. So let this be your PSA. This happens to you, don't do what I did. Don't continue to work. Let your body rest and take some time. Because I wasn't feeling that bad, because I was actually feeling pretty okay all around, I continued to work. And as a result of my loopiness over the past couple of days, I have made some very interesting decisions that I'm now going to have to live with. The first interesting thing that I did was I made 2 of the same side of the collar. Despite being very cautious not to, I did. To me, it's pretty obvious because the black stripes go vertical here and horizontal here. That's just something I think I'm gonna have to live with. I don't think it's gonna be obvious to anyone but myself when I'm actually wearing it, just as what it is. I'm not gonna redo that. Next interesting thing I did was I used this like store-bought bias strip to face the inside of the collar. I never use this stuff. I do not like the store-bought stuff. I just happened to have like a little scrap of it and I was so pleased that it was the right size that I was like, yes, I'm gonna use it. Number one, this stuff is so stiff. It's like made out of poly and it's just like sticking a piece of plastic into something. Second of all, it's very wide. It's very wide and it looks like a proper like collar stand in there. It's too wide. What I wish I had done, obviously it would have been nice to actually make a bias binding out of the self, which is what I usually do, but I didn't have enough of this fabric to do that. I could have used a grosgrain ribbon, which is what I wish I had done. A grosgrain ribbon you can actually press into the correct position, which would have been much nicer for this. As it is, I've gotten this thing pretty solidly in here at this point. I think that I may just trim it a little bit and fold it under and I don't know, just try to make it narrower so that it sits flat. So this problem, it's just gonna have to stay there. I'm not remaking the collar. I couldn't even if I wanted to because I don't have enough fabric. This I don't know. I unpicked the stitching I had done, always fun, and cut the tape down the center-ish. I then folded and stitched the new raw edge. Back to the body of the thing, I folded the sleeve gusset over to match the corner of the other side. I sewed the sleeve seam, both remaining sides of the gusset, and the side seam of the body. I left 3 inches open at each wrist to allow my hand to pass through, and I finished these edges by folding one to the inside and felling it, and the other to the outside and felling it. The edge that was felled to the outside got folded over the inside felled edge when the sleeve seam was ultimately felled. And I definitely felled the rest of the seams inside of the thing, not just this one. I matched the upper cuff to the wrist, right sides together, and sewed. I folded the undercuff over the raw edge and felled it in place. I stitched a button to both edges of the cuff, similarly to the extant garment. I stitched a crocheted thread loop to the sides of one of the buttons, which will loop over the opposite button to close the cuff. When I tried this on, the proportion of the smocking, and specifically the shape of the honeycomb release, made the whole thing look maternity, which is cool, but no. So I added another row of honeycomb and finished it off with a row of white cable stitch. I sewed a 3-inch strip of the cotton voile along the bottom hem right sides together. I pressed the strip to the wrong side and pressed a 1/2-inch seam allowance to the wrong side. Usually I wouldn't trust blind sewing like this, but because the gingham allowed me to be so precise, I stitched the folded hem facing in place from the right side. I sewed 2 machine buttonholes into the front placket and stitched 2 buttons onto the under placket. And that is that. I have to be honest, this was a lot of engineering work, mostly in putting the thing together, but it's pretty solid in the end. It also went a lot faster than I thought. So fast, in fact, I think I need another go at smocking, so look out for that video soon. I also think I need a little breather, a sort of assessment of what I've done in this collection and how I want it to move forward now that I have all this preliminary research making done. So that will be up in a couple of weeks. If you enjoyed this video, I always appreciate a thumbs up, and hit subscribe if you secretly, or not so secretly, love hours and hours of hand stitching. Bye!